License and registration, please.
I already handed them over.
Where are you headed?
To a work assignment.
You expect me to believe that?
This is my federal ID.
That doesn't prove anything.
You can verify it.
Step aside for a moment.
You're not actually checking it, are you?
Wait, you really are federal?
The interaction takes place on a quiet stretch of an urban street near a government office complex. Vehicles pass intermittently, and the hum of traffic is constant but unobtrusive. The man had been driving between official assignments, carrying all required credentials and documentation for his role. He wore a standard suit and carried a briefcase, nothing that would outwardly indicate his federal position. The officer had been on routine patrol for the morning shift, conducting standard checks as part of department procedure. Routine stops like this are common, and officers are trained to verify identification and licenses. In this case, the officer's initial skepticism was fueled by small, everyday assumptions. The man's calm demeanor, the lack of visible insignia, and the timing of the stop during a low-traffic period. None of these factors in isolation suggest wrongdoing, yet they contributed to the officer's doubt. Federal identification differs from standard state-issued credentials. While it is verifiable and legally sufficient, it is less familiar to many officers, especially those early in their careers. The man presented his ID clearly and accurately, but the officer's procedural caution led him to question the legitimacy of the credentials rather than accepting them at face value. This subtle misalignment between standard expectations and federal verification protocol set the stage for a slow escalation. No force was used, and the man remained still and composed, following the officer's requests. The surrounding environment, a nearby coffee shop, parked cars, and a few pedestrians, was neutral, neither contributing to nor disrupting the interaction. The incident occurred in an ordinary urban setting, emphasizing the normalcy of the space despite the unusual nature of the stop. Patterns like this, while statistically infrequent, are documented in departmental records. Officers sometimes misinterpret calm, compliant behavior as suspicious or non-cooperative. Similarly, credentials that differ from what is commonly seen can trigger doubt. In this instance, both factors combined. A calm, professional man with federal identification interacting with a rookie officer unfamiliar with these protocols. This context explains how the misunderstanding escalated quietly. Neither party acted aggressively, but repeated questioning and dismissal of the presented credentials increased tension. The environment, the officer's assumptions, and the procedural gap between state and federal verification all contributed to the situation evolving beyond a typical traffic stop. The facts suggest a scenario where small misjudgments and miscommunications can have consequences, even in routine operations. While the stop itself appeared ordinary, the underlying dynamics, doubt, verification procedures, and unfamiliarity with federal authority created a subtle but meaningful misalignment. This misalignment, unnoticed by observers at first, would later lead to consequences affecting careers, departmental procedures, and public accountability. The man involved in the stop had been serving in federal law enforcement for over a decade. His responsibilities included oversight of investigative operations, coordination with local agencies, and routine travel between offices for meetings and field work. Colleagues described him as thorough, punctual, and consistently professional. His appearance, neatly dressed, composed, and methodical, reflected the standards of his position, though it did not distinguish him visibly from any civilian traveling for business. Prior to this incident, he had encountered small, low-stakes misjudgments in his career. During one routine inspection at a regional office, a local security officer had questioned his clearance despite prior notification from the federal department. The encounter was brief and resolved quickly, but it demonstrated that even long-standing credentials and clear professional documentation could be misunderstood. These experiences were never formally reported, yet they had reinforced his awareness that professional appearance alone did not prevent procedural skepticism. His daily work involved frequent travel along urban and suburban routes, often requiring interactions with local law enforcement. These encounters were typically procedural and unremarkable. He was accustomed to presenting identification, explaining his purpose, and proceeding without incident. In this sense, his approach to traffic stops was methodical and non-confrontational. He maintained consistency in his behavior, ensuring all documents were accessible and interactions were compliant with local and federal regulations. The officer involved in the stop was a recent addition to the department, having completed the academy less than 2 years prior. His training emphasized traffic enforcement, safety protocols, and verification procedures, but it offered limited exposure to federal identification nuances. His understanding of federal authority was based on theoretical instruction rather than practical experience. The combination of inexperience and the officer's diligence in following procedure contributed to the questioning of credentials that, to a seasoned officer, would have been straightforward. This stop was not the first instance of a misjudgment based on appearance or credentials. Within both local and federal records, there are documented cases where compliant professionals were questioned or delayed due to procedural unfamiliarity. The man had developed strategies to navigate these encounters calmly, providing documentation clearly, responding directly to questions, and avoiding any language that might be construed as confrontational. These strategies reflected professional discipline rather than an expectation of misunderstanding. Outside of work, he maintained a consistent lifestyle centered on family and professional obligations. There were no notable incidents in his personal history that influenced this encounter. He had not sought media attention or public recognition for his federal service. His reputation was built within professional circles and internal networks, not public profile. In contrast, the officer's background was primarily local, with experience limited to municipal operations and standard patrol duties. While diligent, the officer had limited exposure to high-level federal operations. There was no indication of bias or malice. The officer's actions were shaped by procedural caution and adherence to training. Misinterpretation of credentials and small behavioral cues set the stage for a misunderstanding that was procedural in nature rather than personal. This section frames both parties as professionals operating within their respective roles. The man's history demonstrates repeated, calm navigation of minor misjudgments, and the officer's background explains how standard procedures can intersect with unfamiliar credentials to produce tension. Both perspectives are grounded in real-world experience, illustrating how routine interactions can unexpectedly escalate despite professionalism and compliance. The interaction began as a standard traffic stop on a mid-morning weekday. The man had pulled over in a marked lane adjacent to a small commercial complex. He parked fully within the lane, leaving adequate space for other vehicles, and switched off the engine. The officer approached on foot, maintaining a standard distance and posture. The surrounding environment included passing cars, the hum of nearby HVAC units from adjacent offices, and occasional pedestrian movement along the sidewalk. The officer began with a routine request. "License and registration, please." The man responded by producing his driver's license and registration, placing both items on the dashboard without hesitation. He explained that he was traveling for a federal assignment, providing a brief description of his route and purpose. The officer listened but did not respond immediately, instead focusing on the credentials and their alignment with departmental expectations. At this stage, the man produced his federal identification, holding it clearly for the officer to see. "This is my federal ID," he said, ensuring the badge and credentials were visible. The officer examined the document, his eyes scanning the details, but he did not acknowledge the authority indicated. Instead, he stated, "That doesn't prove anything. You can verify it," indicating a procedural approach rather than a personal challenge. The man remained composed, responding directly to questions and following the officer's requests without hesitation. He clarified the nature of his work, the scheduling of assignments, and confirmed that all documentation was current and verifiable. He adjusted his posture minimally, keeping both hands visible and avoiding sudden movements, understanding that clarity and calmness were critical in routine stops. As the officer continued to question the credentials, he noted minor discrepancies in format relative to standard state-issued identification. These differences, while minor and procedural, prompted additional verification steps. He asked for confirmation of the man's assignment, location of office, and contact information. Each time, the man provided clear and verifiable responses, repeating information when requested. The surrounding environment remained neutral. One or two employees from nearby offices observed the stop from a distance, but did not approach. Vehicles continued along the adjacent street at a steady pace, some slowing briefly to observe. Background noise included low hum from passing trucks and intermittent car doors closing. There was no crowd, no shouting, no external interference. At one point, the officer misread a gesture from the man. When the man reached for a document in his briefcase, the officer interpreted the movement as reaching for something potentially non-compliant. This subtle misperception prompted a verbal check, and the man responded immediately, stating clearly what he was doing. The exchange added a small degree of tension, but remained fully contained within procedural bounds. Throughout this phase, dialogue remained minimal, factual, and repetitive only as necessary. The man consistently provided information without elaboration, and the officer repeated questions to confirm understanding and adherence to protocol. Each exchange was brief, controlled, and grounded in routine enforcement standards. By the end of this phase, the situation had developed into a contained standoff. The officer had not escalated beyond verbal questioning, and the man had followed all requests accurately. The stage was set for further escalation due to repeated disbelief of credentials, procedural caution, and minor misinterpretations of body language. No force, threats, or overtly dramatic elements occurred, preserving the realism and investigative tone of the interaction. The officer repeated his questions, focusing on details of the man's assignment and the legitimacy of the identification. "Can you confirm your office location again?" he asked. The man responded precisely, providing the federal office address and a direct contact number. Each answer was concise, consistent with prior responses, and aligned with verifiable information. The officer listened but maintained a tone of procedural skepticism rather than hostility. One or two nearby witnesses observed from a distance. A pedestrian paused briefly at the crosswalk, and a delivery driver slowed in the adjacent lane. Neither intervened. Their presence was noted only as a factual element of the environment. The officer's repeated requests and dismissive comments were audible but low in volume. There was no shouting, no crowd reaction, and no overt confrontation. The officer focused on small inconsistencies he perceived in the format of the federal ID relative to local expectations. "That still doesn't look standard," he said. "We see variations like this all the time." The man clarified calmly, "It's issued by the federal department. You can verify it with my office." Each clarification was calm, factual, and repeated only when necessary. At one point, a minor misinterpretation of gesture added tension. As the man reached into his briefcase to retrieve a supporting document, the officer briefly questioned the movement. "What are you reaching for?" he asked. The man explained immediately, "My assignment letter for verification purposes." The clarification resolved the ambiguity but contributed to subtle discomfort. During this phase, there was a brief moment of fear, contained and realistic rather than dramatic. The man realized the officer's repeated disbelief could prolong the stop or escalate it procedurally. He remained still, hands visible, and continued to respond factually. There was no physical threat, but the awareness of procedural misjudgment introduced a low-level concern. The officer's disbelief created a subtle form of humiliation, not through overt confrontation, but through repeated questioning that suggested doubt in the man's authority. Each dismissal of credentials reinforced a quiet tension. The man's responses remained calm, avoiding argument or elaboration, adhering to both professional discipline and protocol. Dialogue remained short and measured. Questions were repeated with minor variation, responses were consistent and neutral. The surrounding environment remained unchanged: background traffic, distant office activity, and the occasional passerby. There were no interruptions, no external agitation, and no dramatic elements introduced artificially. By the end of this escalation phase, the interaction had progressed beyond a routine verification. The officer's repeated skepticism, combined with minor misinterpretations and procedural caution, created a contained but clear pattern of disbelief. The man maintained full compliance and clarity, yet the situation demonstrated how routine stops can slowly intensify when assumptions intersect with unfamiliar credentials. The stage was set for resolution: the introduction of a supervisory authority or verification mechanism that would confirm the man's status and shift the dynamic. The tension remained factual, contained, and realistic, emphasizing procedural escalation rather than personal or emotional drama. A few minutes into the prolonged verification, a supervising officer arrived on the scene. The supervisor approached with standard professional posture, requesting the details of the stop and the credentials presented. The man handed over the federal ID and supporting documentation once again. The supervisor examined the documents carefully, comparing them against the official database while maintaining procedural calm. The surrounding environment remained unchanged: passing vehicles, distant office noises, and the occasional pedestrian. No external audience contributed to the interaction beyond observation. The supervisor's presence alone altered the dynamic. The officer who initiated the stop became more cautious and attentive to protocol. Once the supervisor confirmed the identity and assignment of the man, a subtle shift occurred. The officer hesitated, reviewing the ID and documents a second time. He stepped back slightly, adjusting his posture, a minor but visible acknowledgement of the new information. The verification process was deliberate, factual, and procedural, leaving no room for dramatization or theatrical reaction. The supervisor spoke briefly, stating the confirmation of federal status and verifying the assignment. "Credentials check out. This is a federally assigned officer," the supervisor said. The statement carried neither judgment nor reprimand, only fact. The officer who had questioned the credentials acknowledged the information, quietly adjusting his approach and tone. There was no argument or apology. The correction was procedural and understated. The man remained composed throughout, maintaining calm and professional demeanor. There was no outward sign of satisfaction or frustration. His responses were limited to clarifying any remaining procedural questions. The supervisor's verification ensured the interaction concluded correctly, while subtly highlighting the earlier misjudgment. Following verification, the officer who initiated the stop showed a brief hesitation, a pause consistent with processing unexpected procedural information. He refrained from any additional questioning, and the man was permitted to proceed. The supervisor remained momentarily to ensure all documentation was noted in the report, then departed without further comment. This moment illustrates the effect of authority and verification on procedural interactions. Misjudgment, once identified, was corrected without dramatization or escalation. The officer's initial skepticism gave way to procedural acknowledgement, and the man's compliance ensured the transition occurred smoothly. All actions remained grounded in factual verification and professional conduct. The encounter concluded quietly. There was no confrontation, no audience reaction, and no dramatized response. The resolution was procedural, identity verified, documentation recorded, and the officer adjusted behavior according to factual information. The interaction, though tense in micro terms, resolved without physical or emotional spectacle. By the end of this phase, the procedural reality of federal verification was clearly established. The officer had encountered an unfamiliar protocol and corrected his approach once presented with definitive information. The quiet shift in authority reinforced both the procedural standards and the importance of accurate identification. The man's identity and compliance were now fully recognized, setting the stage for administrative follow-up and review of the stop itself. Following the verified identification, the department initiated an internal review of the officer's actions. Standard procedure required documentation of the stop, verification of all interactions, and assessment of compliance with both local policy and federal coordination protocols. The review focused on the officer's repeated questioning of valid federal credentials, procedural adherence, and any deviations from expected conduct. The officer was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. This step is standard in cases where misjudgments could have professional consequences or indicate gaps in training. The leave was temporary, procedural, and designed to allow a thorough review without implying personal fault or malicious intent. The federal agency involved also conducted an internal review to ensure that the agent's safety and credentials were not compromised during the stop. All documentation from the encounter was submitted, including the officer's initial report, the supervisor's verification notes, and any witness observations. The process was factual, routine, and aimed at maintaining accountability across agencies. Legal counsel for both parties was notified. The officer's department coordinated with municipal attorneys to determine potential liability, procedural revisions, and appropriate corrective action. The federal agency assessed whether additional safeguards were necessary for agents traveling within local jurisdictions. No formal lawsuit had yet been filed, but the review considered potential administrative and legal outcomes. Policy and procedural updates were proposed following the incident. These included clarifications regarding verification of federal credentials, additional training for new officers on identifying federal identification formats, and guidance on handling repeated but compliant inquiries. The updates were designed to reduce the likelihood of similar misjudgments in the future and to streamline cross-agency interactions. Media coverage was factual and restrained. Local news reported the stop as a procedural interaction between a rookie officer and a federally assigned agent. Articles highlighted the verification process, internal review, and the steps being taken to prevent future incidents. Coverage avoided sensational language, focusing instead on procedural lessons and interagency coordination. The officer returned to duty only after completing mandated review and training. The department confirmed that the officer had followed basic procedural steps, but recognized the need for additional guidance in handling federal credentials. There was no public disciplinary spectacle. Consequences were administrative, measured, and aligned with policy. The man involved resumed his routine without further disruption to assignments. Federal and local agencies noted the stop as an example of a minor procedural misjudgment and used it as a case study for improving verification and communication practices. No long-term operational impact occurred, but the incident reinforced the importance of clarity, protocol adherence, and calm, professional responses during stops. This phase illustrates the administrative, legal, and procedural outcomes following the stop. Consequences were visible in documented policy updates, temporary leave, and training requirements rather than in personal drama or public spectacle. The interaction's resolution reflects a real-world approach to accountability and professional conduct, where mistakes are addressed through review, correction, and system improvement. Overall, the aftermath demonstrates that routine procedural misjudgments, when corrected promptly and calmly, can lead to improvements in training and policy while minimizing unnecessary escalation. The consequences were measurable, realistic, and grounded in real-world behavior, providing a model for handling similar incidents in a professional, structured manner. The incident highlights how assumptions can influence routine interactions. Officers are trained to follow procedures, but unfamiliar credentials or subtle behavioral cues can lead to repeated questioning even when all documentation is valid. In this case, the officer's skepticism arose from procedural caution intersecting with limited exposure to federal identification protocols. Implicit bias, while not necessarily conscious or intentional, can affect judgment in low-intensity situations. Small indicators, calm demeanor, professional appearance, or unfamiliar identification can trigger additional verification steps or repeated questions. These actions, while procedural, carry the potential to escalate interactions unnecessarily. Recognizing this pattern is important for departments seeking to reduce misjudgments without attributing personal fault. Verification protocols vary across agencies. State and local officers may not routinely encounter federal credentials, creating minor gaps in knowledge. The incident demonstrates that even experienced professionals can misinterpret compliant behavior or unfamiliar documentation. Standardized training and clear guidance can mitigate these risks and improve consistency in stops involving federal personnel. Procedural reviews, policy adjustments, and training updates serve as practical solutions. They ensure that officers understand verification expectations, reduce repeated questioning of valid credentials, and maintain professional conduct during routine stops. Emphasis on factual verification rather than assumption minimizes the likelihood of similar incidents. The broader lesson is systemic rather than individual. Misjudgments do not require ill intent to have consequences. Subtle misunderstandings can affect careers, operational efficiency, and interagency coordination. Addressing procedural gaps, promoting verification clarity, and maintaining professional standards help prevent minor incidents from escalating. Finally, acknowledging these patterns without judgment allows agencies to implement constructive solutions. Officers can maintain compliance, professionals traveling for work can rely on verifiable identification, and the system as a whole benefits from careful procedural adjustments. The incident provides a case study in measured, real-world lessons that enhance safety, accountability, and clarity. We'd like to hear your perspective on this interaction. Have you ever experienced a situation where credentials or identification were questioned unexpectedly? How did you respond, and what was the outcome? Sharing your experiences helps illustrate the real-world impact of procedural misunderstandings. If you work in law enforcement, security, or federal service, your insights are especially valuable. Observing how routine interactions can escalate, even without intent, provides important lessons for improving training, verification, and professional communication. Please consider leaving a comment below with your thoughts, and feel free to describe similar encounters you have witnessed. Your input contributes to a clearer understanding of how systems function and how small adjustments can prevent unnecessary complications. For more real-world case studies, investigative breakdowns, and factual analysis of procedural interactions, you can follow this channel. The goal is to provide accurate, measured insight into professional encounters, helping viewers understand both the human and systemic aspects of everyday law enforcement situations.